Hello and welcome to another Introductory Statistics instructional video. Today we'll be talking about how to run an analysis of variance, or ANOVA, in StatCrunch. We'll be working with a different random sample of 500 video games this time. So there are two ways that we can run ANOVA in StatCrunch. If we go to Stat, ANOVA, one way. In my class we'll always be doing one way. We never do two-way or repeated measures. We have two options that we can select in here. We can compare, where we select some number of columns, or we have this option down here for values in a single column. For this first example, let's say we want to compare the North American, EU, Japanese, and other sales for all the games in this data set. Notice, looking at the data set, that all of these variables have their own columns. Every observation for EU sales is in this column. Every observation for Japanese sales is in this column. Other sales are all in this column, and you can't see it, but North American sales are all in their own column to the left. So we would leave selected columns checked, and then just select all of the variables we're interested in comparing. We hit compute, and it'll give us our output. We have some useful summary information up here, such as the means, sample sizes, standard deviations, and then we have our ANOVA table. The degrees of freedom, you don't need to know exactly what they mean. All you need to know is that the degrees of freedom here, for associated with columns or treatments, is equal to the number of variables you're comparing minus 1. We're comparing 4 variables here, so we have 4 minus 1 is 3 degrees of freedom. And then your degrees of freedom for error is going to be your sample size minus the number of variables. And then your total degrees of freedom is going to be your sample size minus 1, or it's going to be the sum of these degrees of freedom here. The sums of squares are measures of variability. The sums of squares for your treatment is the variability between groups, while the sums of squares for error is the variability within the groups. These mean squares then take those sums of squares and scale them back based on their respective degrees of freedom. I'll be going into more detail about how to fill out these ANOVA tables in another video. The f-stat is calculated, and then we find the p-value to go with it. Before running through this analysis, there are assumptions that we would need to check, but for now I'm just showing you how you would set this up in StatCrunch. The other way to set up ANOVA, let's say we want to compare the North American sales based on the console manufacturer. Let me just exit out of this so it's easier for us to see. Well, all the values for NA sales are in a single column, and then all of the console manufacturers are in this column. We want to be able to group all of the NA sales with Sony together and then compare those against the NA sales associated with Microsoft, Nintendo Handheld, and PC. To set that up, again we go back to ANOVA one way. This time we're going to check values in a single column. Your responses, that's the quantitative variable that you're analyzing. So for this case we're going to select NA sales. And then factors in is where you select the categorical variable by which you are grouping your responses. Since I'm grouping by publisher or console manufacturer, I'm going to select that for factors in and then hit compute. And we get the same type of output. It's the same way of going about it. You've got your summary statistics here, degrees of freedom, sums of squares, your p-value. Again, you would still need to check the assumptions for ANOVA before going through this procedure, but hopefully that gives you a better idea of how you would set it up in StatCrunch. You need to be mindful of how the data are provided, and you would need to select that compare or values in a single column where appropriate. Alright, so that's ANOVA in StatCrunch.